civic education initiative, which aims not just to promote intellectual diversity here at OU, but also to provide a forum where subjects can be discussed and debated in a reasonable way. And tonight's lecture is possible not by the student funds, but by generous donations of alumni and staff, and by grants from foundations, including in this instance the Charles Koch Foundation. I want to thank them for their support. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Matt Crawford, who's here to talk about attention as a cultural problem. Anyone who teaches, or who has children, or who has attended a work meeting knows the drug-like effect of electronic devices. And when they're around, students, children, coworkers, you, me, feel the tug of the phone. And even when we're in the presence of others who we actually like, we feel the need to open it, to muck around about on it, and to foot around among the apps and to lose ourselves in the phone. We can't help ourselves. And most of us know it, and we know that the phones distract us. But what if they do more than that? What if they don't just distract us from paying attention to those around us, even to those we might love or like? What if they change or possibly even distort who we are as human beings, as individuals? These are among the questions that Matt Crawford deals with in his work, and it's one of the things he's going to talk to us about tonight. Crawford is a visiting fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He's also a motorcycle mechanic. He earned his BA in physics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his PhD in political philosophy from the University of Chicago, where he also held a postdoc. He's published articles on ancient Greek philosophy, neuroscience, the philosophy of science, and has written regularly for the New Atlantis and the New York Times. His books include Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work, which came out from Penguin in 2009, and The World Beyond Your Head, on Becoming an Individual in the Age of Distraction, his latest book, which came out in 2015. And I hope you'll join with me in welcoming Matt to campus tonight.
I want to thank Robert Ingram for the invitation to be here. I met Robert at a sort of an academic retreat, colloquium type thing in Boulder that billed itself as talking about historical documents surrounding the founding of the United States, but it turned out to be devoted almost entirely to drinking. I can report that Robert held it pretty well. So, several years ago, I was in a supermarket, and I swiped my bank card to pay for my groceries. And you know, there's the little screen, and you watch it intently because it prompts you to do the next step where you enter your PIN, confirm the amount. Well, during the intervals between doing those steps, I was shown advertisements on the little screen because some genius figured out that a person in that situation is a captive audience. And the intervals themselves, which I previously assumed were just an artifact of the communication technology, now seem to be something more deliberately calibrated. These haltings now serve somebody's interest. And that's when it hit me that a new frontier of capitalism has been opened up by our self-appointed disruptors. And it's one where you win competitive advantage by being the most ruthless in trying to dig up and monetize every bit of private headspace. If you ride the bus in Seoul, South Korea, there's a smell resembling that of Dunkin' Donuts coffee that's released into the ventilation system of the bus whenever the Dunkin' Donuts jingle plays over the sound system. And of course this happens just as the bus is pulling up outside of Dunkin' Donuts. And the driver points out the fact in case you somehow missed it. There remain many areas for further progress. So in many school districts, the report cards and permission slips and all these little minor communications that a teacher sends home with students are still blank on the back. So here's a gross offense against the efficient use of space. But there's at least one school district in Massachusetts that now sells advertising space on the back of these slips of paper. I learned that from the Colbert Report. And, I think you almost have to be a comedian to wrap your head around contemporary culture. Making my way through O'Hare Airport in Chicago, I'm not feeling especially receptive to the message that's applied to the moving escalator, the handrail on the escalator, in an endlessly recurring loop. It's actually, stuck on there. It says, "You're in charge." I don't feel very in charge. It seems like every surface of public space is getting auctioned off to private interests. And I think that's connected to our wider sense that politics has been captured by such interests. The very idea of a public has been eroded. I get to my gate with an hour to kill, at the airport, and I find that I'm not able to escape the chattering of CNN. If the TV is within view, I find it very hard not to look at it. The introduction of novelty into one's field of view commands what the cognitive psychologists call an orienting response. So an animal turns its face and eyes to the new thing, whatever it is, which of course is an important adaptation in a world of predators, because it could be a python or something. Well, a new thing appears about once every second on TV. The images on the screen jump out of the flow of experience and make a demand on us. In their presence, it's difficult to rehearse or remember conversation, for example. Now, when you're in that situation, sometimes people will stare at their phones or open a novel, hoping to, I think precisely to tune out this piped-in chatter. But in this sort of arms race of attentional technologies, what's lost is the kind of public space that's required for a certain kind of sociability. A public space where people are not self-enclosed in that heightened way that happens when our minds are elsewhere than our bodies, may feel rich with possibility for spontaneous encounters. Even if we don't converse with other people, our mutual reticence is experienced as reticence if our attention is not otherwise bound up, but is rather free to alight upon one another and linger, or not, because we ourselves are free to pay out our attention in deliberate measures. To be the object of someone's reticence is quite different from not being seen by them. We may have a vivid experience of having encountered another person, even if in silence. Such encounters are always ambiguous, and their need for interpretation gives rise to a train of imaginings, often erotic. I think this is what makes cities exciting. Now, when you're trapped at the airport like that, you can simply shift in your seat and avert your gaze from the screens. But the fields of view that haven't been claimed for commerce seem to be getting fewer and narrower. The ever more complete penetration of public spaces by attention-getting technologies exploits the orienting response in a way that preempts sociability, directing us away from one another and toward a manufactured reality, the content of which is determined from afar by private parties that have a material interest in doing so. In the main currents of psychological research, attention is treated as a resource. A person has only so much of it. But we don't yet have a political economy corresponding to this resource. And so toward that end, I want to, as the first step, offer the concept of an attentional commons. There are some resources that we hold in common, such as the air we breathe and the water we drink. We take them for granted, but their widespread availability makes everything else we do possible. I think the absence of noise is a resource of just this sort. More precisely, the valuable thing that we take for granted is the condition of not being addressed. Just as clean air makes it possible to breathe, silence, in this broader sense, is what makes it possible to think. And that's no small thing. We give it up willingly when we're in the company of other people with whom we have some relationship, that is, silence. And when we open ourselves to serendipitous encounters with strangers. To be addressed by mechanized means is an entirely different matter. The benefits of silence are off the books. They're not measured directly by gross domestic product, but surely contribute to creativity and innovation and things that economists do care about. They don't show up explicitly in social statistics, such as level of educational achievement. Yet one consumes, if that's the right word, a great deal of silence in the course of becoming educated. Silence is now offered as a luxury good. So in the business class lounge at Charles de Gaulle Airport, this is in Paris, what you hear is the occasional tinkling of a spoon against china. It's really lovely. I didn't see any ads on the walls. I don't think there were any TVs. And this silence is what makes it feel genuinely luxurious. You step inside and there's these airtight doors that whoosh shut behind you. And the difference is merely tactile. It's like stepping out of hair cloth into satin. Your brow unfurrows itself. Your neck muscles start to relax. And after 20 minutes, you no longer feel exhausted. The hassle lifts. Outside the lounge is the usual airport cacophony. Because we've allowed our attention to be monetized, if you want yours back, you're going to have to pay for it. As the commons gets appropriated, one solution for those who have the means is to leave the commons for private clubs such as the business class lounge. Now, when you consider that it's those in the business lounge who make the decisions that determine the character of the peon lounge, and we may start to see these things in a political light. To engage in playful, inventive thinking, and possibly create wealth for oneself during those idle hours spent at an airport requires silence. But other people's minds, over in the peon lounge or the bus, can be treated as a resource, a standing reserve of purchasing power, to be steered according to brilliant marketing ideas hatched by those enjoying silence in the business lounge. When some people treat the minds of other people as a resource, this is not creating wealth, as the phrase has it. It's a transfer of wealth. The ever greater concentration of wealth in a shrinking elite is surely due to a complex array of causes. But let's just throw one more into the mix for consideration, and that is the ever more aggressive appropriations of the attentional commons that we've allowed to take place. This becomes especially pertinent in an era of big data, when we find ourselves the objects of attention-getting techniques that are not only pervasive, but increasingly well-targeted. There's a lot of talk about a right to privacy in our digital lives these days. But I think we might want to kind of sharpen this conceptually murky idea of a right to privacy by supplementing it with something like a right not to be addressed. I don't know what form that would take. This would apply not, of course, to those who address me face-to-face as individuals, but to those who never show their face and treat my mind as a resource to be harvested by mechanized means. But intrusive advertising is just the tip of a much larger cultural iceberg. We're living through a crisis of attention. and it's now pretty widely remarked upon, usually in the context of some complaints about technology. I want to get beneath the debate about technology and consider what I take to be the more fundamental issue that is in play, and that is the question of how we understand the self and its relationship to the world beyond our heads. Our mental lives are fragmented, and we experience this as a crisis of self-ownership. Our attention is not simply ours to direct as we will. Yet often there's nobody but ourselves to blame, as there are so many enticements that we willingly invite into our lives, from Candy Crush to porn. We find these no less disturbing than intrusive advertising as they crowd out other forms of engagement with our surroundings and with other people. What's at stake seems to be nothing less than the question of whether one can maintain a coherent self. I mean a self is able to act according to settled purposes and ongoing projects rather than flitting about. Now, in grappling with this problem, we understandably reach for ideals that lie close to hand in Western culture. And I think the most prominent of these is freedom. And this is fitting. We feel beset by external forces that appropriate our attention. It's indeed our mental freedom that is at stake, and a political motto comes readily to mind: don't tread on me. But in parsing the problem this way, we quickly run into a difficulty. According to the prevailing notion of freedom, it manifests as satisfying your preferences. This is the language of economics. Preferences themselves are said to be beyond rational scrutiny. They express the authentic core of a self, whose freedom is realized when there are no obstacles to its preference-satisfying behavior. Discovering your true preferences then requires maximizing the number of choices you face. But this is precisely the condition that makes for maximum distraction and dissipation of one's energies. According to this mindset, those who present choices to us appear as facilitators of our own freedom. In other words, the language of freedom, however august its origins in Enlightenment thought, has become the language of marketing. No limits, as the credit card offer says. You're in charge. Now, nobody takes the autonomy talk of marketing seriously, but trying to liberate oneself from all this liberation can induce a bit of cognitive dissonance. There doesn't seem to be any culturally respectable ground on which to take a stand against autonomy talk, that sly appropriation of our most cherished ideal. Further, the effect of so much solicitude for our freedom and the ever more aggressive presentation of choices is to ratchet up the burden of self-regulation. But are we going to be able to self-regulate our way out of the mental fragmentation that has become a defining feature of contemporary life? Self-regulation is a capacity that we have a finite amount of. It's like a muscle, and it's one that's easily exhausted. You can't do it all day, every day. This becomes especially pertinent when our lives are saturated with manufactured experiences that have been designed around us precisely for the sake of capturing our attention. So, by way of analogy, food engineers figured out some time ago how to create what they call hyper-palatable foods, things like Cheetos, by getting the balance of sugar and salt and fat just right. When we relate to the world through a screen of representations that tap into our hardwired susceptibility for certain kinds of stimulation, human experience has become a highly engineered and therefore manipulable thing. The natural world may come to seem bland and tasteless, like broccoli compared to Cheetos. Distractibility then might be regarded as the mental equivalent of obesity. When I was in grad school, this was in the early and mid 90s, late into the late 90s. I would often go to the library and sit there for sometimes 10 hours at a stretch. Get up for food and stuff, but really, in retrospect, it's like amazing ability to concentrate. At this time, the internet was a relative novelty. Email was something that you had to go to a special room to do at the library. It was the room with networked computers. It was the same room where you would go to print out a draft of whatever paper you were working on. So while my paper was printing, I'd go and check my email, and sometimes I'd have one, which was really exciting. And I think at home, my TV got 4 channels. Whereas now, say I open a book of Aristotle and I try to read it. I find that after about a page, I'm drumming my fingers on the table, sort of shifting my weight in the chair, and then I realize, it's Monday night and Sons of Anarchy is on. So much for reading Aristotle. I don't mean to blame TV for my current shallowness. This is actually sort of the golden age of TV, right? There's so much great stuff on it. But it does seem to be a large cultural consequence to our ability to concentrate on things that aren't immediately engaging. And that is the persistence of intellectual diversity, or not. To insist on the importance of trained powers of concentration is to recognize that independence of thought is a fragile thing and requires certain conditions. In other words, I think we're becoming more similar to one another. One thing that distinguishes human beings from other animals is that we're evaluative creatures. We can take a critical stance toward our own activities and aspire to direct ourselves toward objects and projects that we judge to be more worthy than others that may be more immediately gratifying. Animals are guided by appetites that are fixed, and so are we. But we can also form a second-order desire, a desire for a desire, when we entertain some picture of the sort of person we would like to be. A person who is better not because she has more self-control, but because she's moved by worthier desires. Acquiring the tastes of a serious person is what we call education. A few years ago, I visited Las Vegas, which is a place that's really designed for the single purpose of separating you from your money. The female form is used quite freely there in advertisements, and they bombard you from the moment you step off your plane. These images work just as surely as tying a rope to a person's neck and giving it a sharp yank. The point, of course, is to pull you into some casino or other money pit. Once the initial excitement wears on, you start to feel like a rat in a city-sized experiment in social engineering. Nothing subtle, no feeling that isn't industrial strength in its urgency and standardized in its appeal can arise in such a ruthlessly monetized attentional environment. Here, the nudgers are not government bureaucrats, but corporate interests. By the way, ownership of casinos passed from the mob to Wall Street investors in the 1990s. Now, of course, Vegas is an extreme case. But more generally, advanced economies are said by some to be moving away from producing goods or even delivering services in favor of creating experiences. This has been called affective capitalism. This necessarily relies on techniques for attracting and holding attention. So these manufactured experiences you can think of as quasi-autistic escapes from the frustrations of the real world. Life is increasingly saturated with representations crafted from this purpose, from video games to porn, psychoactive drugs, the well-curated eco-tourism adventure. And we can view Vegas as a kind of laboratory where the cutting edge of these arts is being honed. When this is the case, I think self-control will only get us so far. The fuller remedy is rather to become absorbed in some worthy object that has intrinsic appeal and elicits our active involvement in such a way that our mental energies are gathered to a point. Once it's underway, this feels more like abandon than self-control, more like surrender than liberation. The language of eroticism is better suited to parse it than is the language of asceticism, or the liberationist idiom of prickly self-assertion. So let me offer something positive after all this gloomy diagnosis. The word attention is based on a Latin root that means to stretch or make tense. External objects provide an attachment point for the mind. A sufficiently involving object that demands skillful engagement can pull us out of ourselves to join the world beyond our heads, not as passive consumers of manufactured experiences, but as people who act in the world. Skilled practices such as cooking an elaborate meal for an important occasion, playing sports, playing music with other people, building things, fixing things. Such practices establish what I call ecologies of attention that can give coherence to our mental lives, however briefly. The perception of a skilled practitioner is tuned to the affordances for action that present themselves in the particular niche of skill that he inhabits. His activity organizes his perception of the world and dampens extraneous information. Thought and action become unimpeded by the proliferation of choices. When it goes really well, time itself seems to dilate and become something to savor. When this happens, the burden of self-regulation is greatly reduced. It's like having a good meal, to continue the eating metaphor, as opposed to junk food. But here's the thing. These well-ordered ecologies of attention, in which people do really impressive things, are in tension with the ideal of autonomy, which literally means giving a law to oneself. As filtered through maybe French existentialism and other popular thought, this becomes closely allied with the ideal of sincerity, which you might say is the notion that you yourself can be the source of the standards by which you judge yourself. The freedom and dignity of the modern self seem to demand radical independence from the surrounding world, a state of self-sufficiency. I think such an understanding hovers in the background when we use words such as individuality and authenticity. We're supposed to live up to an image of existential heroism and become a self-made person, rather than someone who merely replicates the society he lives in, or the life and world of his parents. Anything that looks like fate is the opposite of autonomy. But such a fixation on the self isn't much in evidence when we look at people absorbed in the kind of skilled practices in which individual creativity actually manifests. So in the book that Robert mentioned, The World Beyond Your Head, it presents a bunch of case studies of cooks, hockey players, jazz musicians, glassmakers, motorcycle racers, and people who build Baroque pipe organs. Count that. In all of these pursuits, people are doing things, and what they do is not simply determined by their own will in glorious isolation. Rather, they achieve competence through submission to things that have their own intractable ways, whether the thing be musical instruments, a garden, or the building of a bridge. It's in the encounter between the self and the brute alien otherness of the real that beautiful things become possible. For example, the puck handling finesse of the hockey player. Material things can serve as a kind of authority for us by way of structuring our attention. Now, the terms authority and submission are jarring to the modern ear, but that's precisely the issue that I'm trying to tease out here. I should say that there's nothing crucial about physical material in this account. The important thing is rather that we're dealing with objects that are external to the self. Other people fit this description nicely. Any practice that brings us into cooperation with others, or in which we answer to standards that are social in nature, can have this unselfing effect. And I'm borrowing this word unselfing from Iris Murdoch. I want to read a short passage from her where she's describing learning a foreign language. She says, if I'm learning, for instance, Russian, I'm confronted by an authoritative structure which commands my respect. The task is difficult, and the goal is distant, and perhaps never entirely attainable. My work is a progressive revelation of something which exists independently of me. Attention is rewarded by knowledge of reality. Love of Russian leads me away from myself toward something alien to me, something which my consciousness cannot take over, swallow up, deny, or make unreal. Consider another example, music. The kind of collaborative improvisation that takes place between musicians in bluegrass, jazz, or classical Indian music is a good example of what I mean by an ecology of attention. It's mutually adaptive. The improvisation is possible because all parties are attending to one another. It's fruitful only because they're also steeped in forms. The history of their art has become the genetic material, the constitutive fiber of their own creativity. A master jazz musician quotes from the real book with the same ease that a master preacher does from the Gospels and the illusion is gotten. It may be taken up and commented upon by the other players. It may be pushed forward toward possibilities that hadn't existed moments before, as they come into being only through the improvisation itself. One must be alert, opportunistic. As an ecology, that is how new forms arise. Now note that worries about conformity versus individuality are simply put aside in the account of creativity that I've just sketched. More strongly, I think we could say that membership in the community is a prerequisite to creativity. What it means to learn Russian is to become part of the community of Russian speakers, without whom there would be no such thing as Russian. Likewise with jazz. These communities and aesthetic traditions provide a kind of cultural jig within which our energies get ordered. Now that may sound obvious, I think it sounds obvious to me, but it's at odds with the whole tradition of individualism that you can trace back to Descartes if you want. He said, Descartes set out to, quote, reject example or custom in order to reform my own thoughts and to build upon a foundation which is completely my own. His point was to free his mind from any taint of the kind of authority that operates authorities in communities. Hundreds of years later, Norman Mailer was still doggedly trying to secure the dignity of the self against the influence of other people. To live authentically, he said, one has to, quote, divorce oneself from society, to exist without roots, to set out on that uncharted journey into the rebellious imperatives of the self, which to me sounds like a kind of parody of individualism. I don't really have a conclusion to offer you, but just by way of stopping, I'll say that at this point in the history of the West, we can notice that the grand liberationist project leaves us isolated. Many inherited forms of cultural authority have been dismantled. And so each of us, as a sovereign individual, faces the problem of composing a coherent life on his or her own. Given the explosion of options presented to us ever more aggressively, this requires more self-regulation than can realistically be expected of us. The actual effect of so much bogus autonomy is to make us more pliable to those who want to monetize our attention. We may need to reinterpret what are often taken to be sources of unfreedom in the liberal tradition, and view them rather as the framing conditions for many of the most worthwhile human performances. This would be to shift one's concern from freedom to agency. The imperative then is not to guard one's independence, but to become skilled. Thank you. Your procedure here, but I'm happy to take questions. And it's a small room, so you probably don't need a microphone. So just raise your hand.
So you did a very good job of outlining the kind of commercial intrusion on the public mind, public space. What do you think of the kind of broader philosophical kind of age in which we live in, where postmodernity, where the postmodern philosophy also kind of has this perverse dynamic where it, in many ways, kind of dovetails with this kind of commercial mentality of this kind of hyper individuality, this kind of social construction itself, this idea that people are just plastic, right? Do you see any kind of symbiosis there between the two? And if so, how do you see the nature of that?
That's great. Great point. Yeah, I mean, this sort of postmodern picture of the self, I mean, speaking loosely here, is often, that the sort of unstable, sort of, I can even conjure the language here, but somehow there isn't actually a self, right? That it's all. There's also the operation of power, And from that perspective, it doesn't seem like there's any clear reason to articulate a critique of the forces that scatter our minds. So I think I have to think more about that, but I think you're right to point it in that direction, that there's some kind of affinity there between a picture of self that comes into view tacitly in commercial culture and what they call the death of the subject in sort of fancy English departments, where the self kind of dissolves into what, I don't know. I'll have to think more about that. Thank you. Yes?
The obvious question is, would you like to be Facebook friends? I'm interested in your thoughts on how this will play out in the next generation. A particular example comes to mind where I was recently in an airport with my 5-year-old. I always travel with toys, and I have older kids and 5-year-olds. So with my older kids, we would go to an airport with a backpack full of toys, bring out some bouncy balls, race cars, other children sort of uniting around some scarce playthings, learn names, and you have instant playmates for a So recently, I did the same thing, got out some bouncy balls and race cars, and scanned the room, and there were 3 age-appropriate children, all behind screens, even with invitations, where I took my 5-year-old and said, would you like to come play with us? We were denied. And no, I don't want to play. I'm on whatever race car app.
Yeah.
So my question is, first of all, for my 5-year-old then, she has less, she learned something from that experience that will, I think, change how she approaches, or if she will approach strangers.
Like, how would you put what she learned from that?
Well, I think that my older girls learned to be gracious, to share, all of those like sort of fundamental lessons of community in a situation that she's not learning. And I'm interested if you have any thoughts on what that looks like, because you obviously think about this a lot more than I do, but what does this look like in in 15 years, 20 years? What is that going to lead us to? Like less of something or more, I don't know, less social skills or more?
Well, it does seem like it tends toward a kind of self-enclosure, right? And so we're each in our little me world of whatever entertainment we choose from the infinite options. And given those options, to interact with those who are actually present to you is probably not the most amusing one at any given moment, so it can't really compete. Yeah, it's pretty disturbing, and it's a really nice anecdote. I mean, horrifying, but useful. And I sort of hint at a political worry here, or more than a hint, namely that, again, experience, sort of the actual content of our experiences is a highly engineered, manipulable thing. So the worry is that we're becoming kind of more passive, more dependent, more pliable to large-scale commercial forces. But I think there's actually a more fundamental worry, which is the one that you're gesturing at, which is basic kind of developmental social capacities. And where we're headed, I don't know. I mean, people are more, as you yourself are, aware of these kind of these risks. So I think there's a growing awareness about it. But I have kids too, and it's hard to draw a line because they're peers, right? There's some of this stuff. I think I don't have an easy answer to that. So I appreciate the point. There's one over there.
Yeah. So obviously, airports. You talked about airports earlier. They're inherently busy and hectic. They're not really designed to have like the same zen-like aura of a library. So do you think it's fair for the individual to demand that society quiets down for them rather than find a quiet place for their own?
I would want to make a strong distinction between the hustle and bustle of commerce or travel, that's sort of the part that's intrinsic to just getting the business done, and the gratuitous sort of auctioning off of every surface to make a claim on our attention. Let me offer 2 kind of other examples. All right, well, so I was in the train station in Philadelphia, which is this beautiful old train station, in the heart of the city. But you could tell that it was beautiful only by trying to somehow peer around or through these swimming pool-sized banners that covered the walls, literally. And they were all for a single enterprise. On this occasion, it was for a resort in the Bahamas. And I learned later this is called the Station Domination Campaign. So this is a thing. And I felt like I was in a place that was somehow no longer a place. It was a mere surface for the display of enticements to be somewhere else. And what that made me feel was, Philadelphia, don't you have any pride? It sort of triggered the thought that, the idea of the public has been eroded here. But let me offer a positive example, sort of along the same lines. Grand Central Station in New York, which used to be called the Indoors Times Square. It was horrible. But in the 90s, there was an effort to clean it up. And now it has a kind of grandeur in it. You walk in there, and it's like I imagine a Roman citizen might have felt walking into the Colosseum. I'm a Roman. Look at this. This is for me as a citizen. Now, the interesting thing is that what they did is that they replaced all the marketing with retail, which might sound like, what's the difference? But it's actually quite a big difference. The retail is quite muted. All of the signage is for, that actual store that the sign is on, right? Not, some random thing from nowhere. And I like this example because it shows that this doesn't have to be an anti-commerce argument. Commerce is part of the life of the city. It's how we interact with other people. And another interesting fact is that they're actually getting more revenue from the retail than they were from the marketing. So in other words, here's a case where some enlightened bureaucrat decided to act on behalf of this hard to articulate kind of fact about public space, that it's a valuable thing. And to manage to do so, while actually increasing, revenue to the transportation authority. So, I forget what you asked, but that's what. Yeah.
I have a question. It's already been touched on a number of times, but do you think that all this technology is making us older people less social? And is this going to continue? Is this the next step of bowling alone? It doesn't seem like my generation in particular necessarily likes hanging out with, actually. Yeah.
That just on the face of it, that seems to be the case. I will confess, I'm getting back to the parenting issue. We often call kids with their devices. It's actually parents with their devices, and I'm as guilty as anyone of that. And I've kind of realized that parenting small children is like perfectly designed to make you need a smartphone. Because you have these intervals of, okay, you need to get your pajamas on, right? But that actually takes half an hour, and you're just kind of standing there and just you need some kind of stimulation. Before I had the smartphone, I would find myself pulling like junk mail circulars out of the trash and ardently reading them, fantasy shopping for teeth whitening strips or something that I never knew I wanted before. So there's something about the rhythms of parenting where you have this chopped up time that you can't get absorbed in anything that really lends itself to this.
So you teach college age students?
Actually, I don't.
You don't? Okay. Well, my question is, if you could give a prescriptive to higher education about what are the sorts of habits and patterns and priorities that we can put upon the university communities that we work with, what would it be?
Well, actually, just on the drive from the airport, Robert mentioned something he does. You know, I shared about so I guess it's been an evolving experiment for him, but he did away with laptops in the classroom, which seems like a no-brainer to me. But then he also, you give a certain amount of credit, course credit, if people will deposit their phones in front of the room at the beginning of class. And he reports that kind of changes the vibe in the classroom, that Well, for one thing, the students report they feel kind of liberated, because it is like this kind of compulsive, obligatory thing. But also that people are paying more attention to the lecture, or not. They might be doodling or daydreaming or something, but in any case, they're not in this kind of industrialized, kind of treadmill of checking Facebook or whatever it is. So that's just a very commonsensical, obvious thing that sounds interesting. Beyond that, I don't really have practical advice. But, talking to one of the professors, I'm sure could come up with something. Yeah.
You were talking about how, specifically in the airport, when the lounge is kind of something that is rather quiet and kind of resembles commerce. Do you think that in the future it's going to become not necessarily privacy, but calmness and like tranquility is going to become something that's more for like the elitists?
I think it already has. I mean, the business class lounge is the clearest example of that. But it's funny, I went on that very same flight, I went from Paris with the round that was grabbed to Detroit, which is a hard transition to make. And for a number of reasons. But the business class lounge there was full of TVs. But the lounge sort of broken up into smaller spaces, each of which has at least one big screen. So I went and I was like, I was so exhausted. I said, does anyone mind if I turn off the TV? And immediately this guy said, yes, please. I went up to the TV and there was no way to turn it on. But I think, it confirmed an intuition I had, which is that this is not in response to demands. Like, where are the TVs? I don't think, and similarly with the news app in restaurants, it's hard to understand exactly what's going on, because it's even hard to understand, like, where's the profit motive in doing this? I mean, maybe, with the airport, you have special airport CNN. I'm sure there's some monetary arrangement with the airport authority, whatever. But why is it that, in bars and restaurants, this has become so ubiquitous? And at least whenever I bring it up with people, they almost always say, yeah, what's the deal? It's like there's this mysterious imperative to chase away silence. Maybe some kind of existential dread rises up when you don't have this stuff on. It's hard to say. And then also it's like sporting events. I live across the street from a college stadium that has baseball games in the summer. And between innings, it's all filled up with thundering excitement. So there seems to be this imperative to manage the mood in any kind of public gathering. That again is hard to see that anyone's making money from this. It just becomes more. So one sort of set of people I hope will read this book is like building managers, interior designers, whoever it is that makes these decisions. But I think it's largely unthought. It's just kind of crept over the culture without anyone really thinking it through. Yeah.
So, if the public space is becoming what becomes of the citizen?
Well, you answered your own question. I tried, this maybe it's slightly tendentious, but I tried to understand this as a transfer of wealth. I don't think it's tendentious, actually. Attention is a resource, and you can kind of reductively kind of force that into, that our attention is convertible into money. This is sort of, what the economists might demand that I do to call it a transfer of wealth. I don't think you have to go that far. It's intrinsically something scarce, and what you attend to determines what's actually present to your consciousness, so it's important, therefore valuable. So yeah, it's I think it's an especially intimate kind of intrusion, and therefore I think we do need to think about it politically. And in the book, I have a whole chapter devoted to machine gambling in Vegas, which is where the whole business model is to create addiction by design. And they're very sophisticated about the latest, cognitive science, and they're using basically behavioral conditioning to achieve it. It's some really dark stuff, and there's some great literature on it. But more recently, that business model and even some of the same personnel from that industry have been moving into the mobile gaming world, meaning stuff on your phone. And you might say, how is, playing Candy Crush on your phone, how's that gambling? There's no jackpot, you're not hoping to win anything. Well, what you have to realize is that gambling addicts have no hope of winning. They're not that stupid. It's all about getting into what they call the zone, this kind of catatonic state where it's relaxing, the speed is relaxing. It has kind of all the same features as a chemical addiction. So, so Silicon Valley cats have been talking to the Vegas cats, and time on device, something like that. It's some dark stuff. Yeah.
So you talked about how kind of our bogus economy and our the burden of self-regulation has made people less independent thinkers and philosophical pliable in like the political side of things. So how do you think that has contributed at all to what we're seeing as far as a wider polarization of the politics of the public?
That seems like might be able to draw some kind of connection. I guess I'll try to freestyle on that. Just the fact that politics has become sort of reality TV sport. It's obviously a calculation on the part of the participants that what we want to see and hear is what we got. Or I don't know, maybe that's putting it too deliberately. I don't know if there's any calculation, it's just somehow the logic of it seems to. I don't have an answer. It's but maybe our mental fragmentation and diminished attention spans means that we're not going to tune into the political process unless it's digestible and sensational and stimulating and small activities like that. That just seems obvious. Maybe one more?
Yeah, can I just use the drawing?
Yeah.
And not hang around. So there's some people in the room who have jobs, and they may be looking around at someone who I know have jobs. They like the jobs, right? It's jobs that they can pay attention to. And there are a lot of people who are going to be looking for jobs, right? But a lot of the students aren't going to find jobs to which they can pay attention to. So they can't be a hockey player or the pipe organ maker. And in fact, a lot of students, we all know, they say, well, I'm a business major. Why are you a business major? I'm a business and history major, a business and philosophy major. I'm a business major, my parents want me to be, right? It's not a good job. And in fact, the very jobs that they'll be doing will be distracting, right? So what thoughts do you have on students going out into the workforce, trying to get jobs that might not allow them to have attention to the sort of you have, not going to be, in a sense, fully human, right? I think if your argument is that. Where do you find that sort of attention in the world where the jobs you have might not be ones for which you can actually pay
Well, not coincidentally, a lot of the examples I give in this book are not work, they're more like leisure activities. Because it's, I mean, to actually make a living doing something that is so rich that it would, you know, that you'd be absorbed all day long, that's a pretty tall order, indeed. And, you know, work is unpleasant. That's the first thing I say to students. So if you're lucky enough to get some, so yeah, so don't hope for too much. This is my inspirational speech. Having said that, I think what makes for a good job is one where you can see a direct effect of your actions in the world, and feel like these were genuinely your own actions. And that can be hard to come by because so much work is subject to abstraction and, you know, huge collaboration where you're just working on a tiny little piece of it. I mean, that's why the first book is about skilled trades, because that's an area where you can reliably, every day, have that experience of seeing in the world fruit of your own labor. There's something very satisfying about that. So, good luck to you all finding jobs, getting yourself educated. That's a good one.